Listening to the two of you has triggered a series of thoughts, and if you'll allow me, because they're seemingly unrelated personal thoughts, but they're going to come back to a question. You reminded me, Peter, that I'm not even sure we met on that occasion, but the first time I encountered you was at a public radio meeting in San Diego, I think in 1981. So I think it's our 30th anniversary, and you said something that, in paraphrase, I've quoted or misquoted about 1,000 times, and I've been meaning to ask you all these years about it. And let me lay that out, and then I'm going to go in a very different direction and ask you a question. You said, in a society and in a life where there's very little genuine privacy left to us, our experience of the arts is one of the few profoundly private things. And one can experience something, you can look at a painting, see a new play, read a book, and utter some pre-digested nonsense that you read in a book review, or try to sound in cocktail conversation intelligent. But when all is said and done, and you go home and your head hits the pillow and the lights are out, you're going to think what you did. It's between you and it, and it's deeply and ultimately profoundly private, our encounter with art. So that's thought number one. And in listening to you, I thought about something I haven't thought in years, which is how, and both of you have suggested it in very substantial ways, how the mythology or the narrative of war, the telling of war, is controlled and shifts with the grains of time. And it reminded me, in my wife's family, there was, he's no longer living, a mysterious relative, an Uncle Bob, who was, the terminology was shell-shocked in World War II. I think we now call it post-traumatic stress disorder. And rightly or wrongly, the telling of American soldiers in World War II is a heroic and stirring tale. It's almost too mythologized in The Greatest Generation. And in the writing and the telling of that story, it overlooks Uncle Bob, who returned from World War II a kind of living ghost, didn't communicate, was looked after for the 40 or 50 years that remained in his life, was mute, was non-functional, and was a living ghost. I can't describe it any other way. He wasn't listed among the casualties of World War II, but in every way imaginable, he was a casualty of World War II. And recently, there have been a spate of books that broaden our understanding of World War II, that aren't necessarily revisionist, but just, with a certain amount of distance, the narrative is getting broader and allowing room for, Kurt Vonnegut did it years earlier with the firebombing of Dresden and Slaughterhouse 5, but that broader telling of the totality of the picture is beginning to emerge over time, and maybe there'll be somebody has or will tell the story of their own Uncle Bob, who was a mute casualty, a living mute casualty of World War II. And so I wanted to ask the general question to Mark about what the telling of war, even when we have some distance from it, says about us. And then this powerful privacy that Peter put in my head 30 years ago. If the artist, as a teardrop in the ocean, as Richard Tognetti so eloquently said it, has a chance to be a pipeline to that private spot and raise some of those questions. So I throw it to both of you in order.
Gosh, I can tell you guys have known each other a long time. You ask questions just like he does. That was a really, by which I mean that was an extremely eloquent question and thought-provoking, beyond thought-provoking. You know, I think the number, I'm very glad you pointed out the ghosts, because there are great numbers of them from every war, I think. And I grew up, certainly my first exposure to war and what it was came from stories from my father, who told me stories from World War II, who had fought. He actually went ashore in Okinawa. He was on an aircraft carrier, and only recently, as he told me, he actually went ashore. The members of their ship were offered a visit after the battle was over. And he never told me this before, I guess because it was so gruesome. He told me he was one of 5 out of a ship of more than 2,000 men. And he went ashore and he said that the bodies in body bags were stacked like cordwood. And it was like these avenues of wood that you would go through. There were so many of them, one after another. He didn't even realize at first they were bodies. They looked like some kind of wood or something else that was stacked in the distance. But he told me these stories when I was very young. We'd be in the car taking a long car trip, and he would talk about what war was like. And he also, if we're talking about the telling of war, he made the point to me that being in this war had changed his life in a very unusual way, because he had realized at a certain moment, he was on the deck of an aircraft carrier and a Zero was flying at the deck. This was off Okinawa, where kamikazes, suicide bombers, planes, had just become a big, big problem, and they almost turned the course of the war when the Japanese started using them, whole squadrons of them. And he said at a certain moment, he saw this plane coming, and he thought, he's trying to kill me. Why would he be trying to kill me? And my father always makes the point that only young men can be sent to war because they're the only ones stupid enough to do it. You know, old men know young men are stupid enough to go to war. Anyway, this, and by his telling, began a transformation in him where he thought, I'm here, I nearly died just now, and I have no idea why I'm here. I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea where these planes are coming from or what we're fighting for or where we're going. And he began a process of self-education, of reading history, which led him to, he'd worked in a factory before leaving for war, and he made his way into college after coming back, and he became a lifelong student of history and discovered that this perception that you're in a war and you have no idea what the hell's going on runs through literature in a very distinctive way in the telling of war. There's a very obvious depiction of, does anybody here know The Charterhouse of Parma, Stendhal's great novel? Well, there's a great passage, of course, at the beginning at the Battle of Waterloo, when Fabrizio is running around the battlefield with no idea what's going on. I mean, it's serio-comic. It was, speaking of Tolstoy, enormously admired by Tolstoy, who put a passage very much like it with Pierre at the Battle of Borodino, in War and Peace, which was admired very much by Stephen Crane, who wrote an entire book on the same theme called The Red Badge of Courage. So this theme that my father latched onto is kind of part of a sort of ritual of enlightenment that goes back, I'd say, very, very far. And it's about how to tell war, that difference between the moral mission that I began with today, we began with and talking about, and the experience of the individual soldier, which is one of horror, bewilderment, near death, occasionally sadism, and who knows where Bob became a ghost and what it was he saw that transformed him into that. But it's safe to say that it didn't have to do with his thoughts about the moral mission of the U.S. in the world. It had to do with that perception of he's trying to kill me, and why, or perhaps even the more traumatic perception, I have to kill him right now. I must kill him. I mean, it is, this upside down world. If you've ever covered war, something, as usual, when you get close to things, it's always the obvious perception that you thought you understood that clangorously echoes in your head, and you realize you didn't understand at all. And the obvious perception about war is we spend our whole lives dealing with people, talking to people, dealing with them every day, and the thought of killing them is something completely perverse and insane. Of course, why would you kill somebody? Never. You wouldn't do that, ever. And suddenly you're placed in a world where your job is not only to kill people, but to kill people you don't know, who have no relation to you, and to kill them in absolutely horrible ways. And sometimes you're doing it because they're about to kill you, but other times you're just doing it. And I think that is morally can be catastrophic. It should be said also that some people thrive in it. Some people. I think a relatively small number, but some people certainly thrive in it. But others, I think, suffer in exactly the way you describe. And it's the mission, if the artist has a particular mission in this regard, it's somehow in that moment that Peter described to you of that personal encounter, to somehow embody that. And when you look at the literature of our century, The Wasteland comes to mind immediately. The Wasteland is a poem that all of us probably read in college. Well, it's impossible to conceive of apart from World War I. It's a poem basically about World War I. World War I is not mentioned in it, but it's about what happens to a culture that thinks it is the vanguard of the world, civilization. The essence of it is civilization, the European world, the colonizing European world that seizes the right to rule over the rest of the planet because of its glamorous civilization, its streetcars, its lights, its opera, its painting, that then spends 4 years on the battlefield using the fruits of the highest technology of the time, cannons, tanks, machine guns, Gatling guns, to, at an industrial scale, kill millions of people, including in one battle, more than 1 million in a single battle, the Battle of the Somme, and to wipe out an entire generation in Britain and France. So you have, our encounters of the Wasteland, as you look back to college and reading it, whatever, are, I'm sure, very different. But to me, it's always been a poem that's profoundly about the exhaustion of a civilization after it's done that to itself, having had the impression, Henry James said this in a letter at the beginning of the war in 1914, that to think of all those golden years, all those years in which we thought the world was gradually bettering, that it was all heading toward this spectacle of barbarism that we're witnessing, is too painful for any words. I did have a happy part at the beginning of the...
No, and that's why there's music.